There we have it. Okay.
Great. Great.
So, welcome, Brennan, for our last session. Just for those of you who were here last week may remember that Brennan was in Bologna, having just arrived the day before on a Tuesday and then gave his presentation on Daniel last week. He just arrived, I think Brennan said about 2 hours ago, back home in New Jersey. So, and again, if I do the math correctly, it's about 1 in the morning, European time, right?
Yeah.
Right now. So again, having done this trip back and forth many, many times while I was working, I admire your stamina and the fact that you are here with us with a smile on your face and a twinkle in your eye. So Brennan, I will turn it over to you for our session tonight.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here as always. When I return back home from a trip, I'm sure it'll catch up with me in about an hour. But for now, I'm still feeling good. Well, let me pray for us to open our time, and then we'll take a look at the last few chapters of Daniel that are most of them one vision that really talks about the end. So we'll talk about this shift in apocalyptic literature to start talking about the end of all things, the end of time itself, and the first mention of the resurrection in the Bible. So we'll talk a little bit about what that resurrection looks like in Daniel and how it connects to the New Testament. All right, I'll open us to prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for today. We thank you for this gift of this day. For some of us, the day has lasted longer than 24 hours, but this has been a good day that you have made. We ask for your grace and for your presence with us as we study your word. We ask that you would open our eyes and our ears that we might hear your word and that we might perceive where you are at work in the word and then also in the world around us. Help us to have faith that you are with us in life and in death. We belong to you. Amen.
Amen. I don't know if you had a chance to catch up on things, Brennan, but I guess you are Cory Booker. I don't know if you heard Cory Booker spoke on the Senate floor for 25 hours.
Yeah, I heard this. Yeah,
you are our speaker who is on for more than a day. So you're in good company.
Unbelievable. Yeah. Thank goodness I watched some movies on the plane. yeah. But so thankfully I've only spoken for 1 hour of the day. But thank you guys. So the second half of the book of Daniel is what we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, and that second half of the book of Daniel is the first appearance of apocalyptic literature in the Bible. There are some texts in the Bible that sound a little bit like apocalyptic literature that were written before Daniel 7 through 12. But Daniel 7 through 12 are the earliest biblical apocalypses or books that are apocalyptic actual chapters. They follow what we would call an apocalyptic structure. The whole book of Revelation is apocalyptic. And we would say that apocalyptic theology or that like apocalyptic ideas suffuse the New Testament and are an important foundation for Jesus's own way of talking about himself and about his mission. That is to say, Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet who talked about the end of the world, who talked about resurrection, and Paul was as well. Paul talks about the end of things, the end of the world, and he talks about this divine judgment that will come someday, and also something that comes after the judgment. So something like a resurrection. So there are a number of texts that seem like they talk about resurrection in the Old Testament, and that often are lifted up as discussions of resurrection in the Old Testament. But when we look at them closely, they're a little bit different. They're not quite what Christians are talking about when they talk about the resurrection of Jesus. When we talk about there's a couple of stories in the book of Kings, especially 1 Kings 17, which is when Elijah the prophet first emerges in the Bible. And Elijah has a few miracles, and then Elisha, Elijah's disciple, has a few miracles as well that involve the resuscitation of people who have died. These are sometimes called resurrection miracles. So there's a child who dies, and Elijah prays, and the child comes back to life. Um, Biblical scholars and theologians would say that these aren't resurrection stories because resurrection occurs after a final death. These are resuscitation stories, kind of like the people will talk about the Lazarus story in the Gospel of John as a resurrection, but really it's a resuscitation of Lazarus. Lazarus he died again, like he had a second death, a natural death at some point. And then later, we imagine that Lazarus will be resurrected. So that is to say, he wasn't resurrected when Jesus called him out of the grave, he was resuscitated. The same thing happens in the Old Testament a few times that people have their life returned to them. Uh, but when we look elsewhere in the Old Testament, there are no comments about a substantial life after death. Let's say that. There are mentions of what's called Sheol, Sheol. And this is a word that sometimes gets translated by other terms. Sometimes some translations translate it as hell, which it's not. There's no actual hell in the Old Testament. The closest we get is Daniel 12, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But there's no heaven and no hell in the Old Testament in the ways that we think about heaven and hell, like a place of bliss and reward and presence of God, heaven, and a place of eternal judgment, damnation, and torture or pain, right? Hell, right? There's no concept of that of those two places in the Old Testament. Instead, there's one place. The Old Testament says this many times. The witness of the Old Testament is that there is a shady, poorly understood afterlife to which everyone goes, called Sheol, the place of the dead, where there is a minimal existence. It's like there's no happiness there really, and there's not pain necessarily either, but it's just a bare subsistence, or some kind of like it's like being in a grave. You can't really do much and you can't say much. And so we hear psalmists when we read the Psalms. Some Psalms say, "You won't hear my voice anymore when I go to Sheol, the place of the dead." We see some texts that talk about going down to Sheol full of days and happy. That is to say, you've lived a happy life. The ending of the book of Job, Job dies, but he's at the end of the book of Job. It talks about how after his suffering, he had this long, full life, full of days, and then he went down to Sheol and he was fine. We also hear about people who go down to Sheol prematurely, or their life is interrupted in some way, or there's some sort of great sadness that they bring with them to the grave, and that's going down to Sheol unhappy. And this is like in the Jacob story. It's really the beginning of the Joseph story in Genesis when Joseph's brothers show the clothing that they have manipulated to pretend like Joseph has been eaten by a wild animal, and that he has this bloody clothing that the brothers show to Jacob, and Jacob cries and is very upset, and he says, "I'm going to go down to the to Sheol, very unhappy, in mourning." And so those are really the two things that happen with death in the Old Testament. You can go down to Sheol full of days and having lived a good long life and so happy, or you can go down to Sheol with some sort of great grievous injury, like the death of a son that you're mourning, and those are or people who die young. It's said that they go to Sheol sort of unfulfilled. So those are the two ways that in the Old Testament they talk about talk about death. Uh, they do talk a little bit about living on, but in the Old Testament, living on typically is understood to happen through children, like progeny. This is why for Abraham and Sarah, having kids is such a big deal. Today, we don't think about our like living on in the same way, but we some of us do, and some of us do in different ways. I've met some folks that are worried because like they either haven't had children, or there's like they're not passing on their name in some way, or DNA isn't being passed on. There's some kind of maybe primal, biological kind of anxiety about some of these things. But at the same time, there's there is a sense today that there's a lot of ways that your name can live on, a lot of different ways, right? If you are someone who does lots of great works of service in your community, people will remember you. They might put a plaque up somewhere. Your name lives on somehow. In the Old Testament, the primary way that you live on is through children, and that the children kind of remember you and memorialize you and talk about you. And this is the way that one lives on. So that's what you have. And they don't talk much about what actually happens in the afterlife. And when they do, it's in very strange and kind of strange to us, very different ways, but it's not systematic. There's no clear thread that runs through all these different descriptions, always very vague about whatever happens after one dies. In the book of Daniel, for the first time ever, we get a very clear statement. Well, it's not very clear to us exactly, but it's much more clear than any other statement in the Old Testament about what might happen after death. And there's, for the first time ever, this division into basically the good and the bad. That is to say, it's not about whether you go down to Sheol, having the land of the dead, having had some kind of crisis, or if you're going down to the land of the dead prematurely. That's not really an issue. It's, were you a moral person? Did you do the right thing? Did you persecute the righteous? Is basically the big question at the end of the book of Daniel. And if you persecuted the righteous and the faithful, those who are faithful to God, then there's some sort of judgment waiting for you. And if you were faithful and were killed, then there is some sort of reward. So we'll work up to this, but this is the big question of today. I'll point out at the end what exactly Daniel 12 means by this, but also how it differs somewhat from the New Testament's understanding of resurrection. So we'll I'll come on back to that, but let's back up for just a moment. We finished last time with chapter 7. The week before that, we started with chapter 8. I took those out of order just to remind us that chapter 8 is easier to read. It's a little clearer about what it's describing. It's a little more direct in saying, basically, this is Alexander, this animal represents Persia, etc. It's a little clearer structure. Chapter 7 is a little more complicated, but we read that last week. And this week, we're going to talk about two different visions. Briefly, I'll talk about chapter 9, but then chapters 10, 11, and 12 are just one vision. It's like one mega vision. So chapter 7 is a vision all by itself, and then chapter 8 is kind of the same thing, just a different storytelling, a different way of putting it, a different vision, but it has the same point to it. Chapter 9 then is different, has its own unique message, and then chapters 10 through 12 are one message. So it's basically we have four visions: chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, and then chapters 10 through 12. So chapter 9 is different than any of the other visions in any part of Daniel, because Daniel's reading a book. And so it says that he was reading this book, the book of Jeremiah, very closely. Now, twice, Jeremiah, who was a prophet during the time of the exile and before the time of the exile, he had a really important message for the exiles, the people who were sent away from Jerusalem. And his message, they didn't know if they would ever come back to Jerusalem. This is in the year 587 BC. Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem and deports many people to Babylon. When that happened, people did not know if there would ever be a temple again, if Jerusalem would ever be rebuilt again. Many cities in the ancient world were destroyed and never rebuilt. They didn't know if they'd ever go back to see it as their home. So there were a lot of open questions that happened during the exile. And Jeremiah writes several times in his book, he writes this prophecy that there's going to be 70 years. So that this will be a 70-year thing. So if you think about that, there were some prophets in the book of Jeremiah who say this exile is going to take a week. and then God's gonna like snap out of it and fix everything, and we're gonna go back home immediately. So don't worry about this. Then there were other prophets who were saying, Yahweh's done with us. We're dead as a people. We got to just become Babylonians. Yahweh, like God has abandoned us. Now we have to like seek help from other gods, the Babylonian gods. So these are very, very different messages, but both of them were being spoken. And so Jeremiah ends up saying, no, we need to stay faithful to Yahweh. We're not going to become Babylonians, but also it's not just going to be a week or a month. This is a generational thing. It's going to be people's grandkids are going to be able to come back to Jerusalem. So Jeremiah writes the 70-year prophecy. He says it'll be 70 years. Now, the exile wasn't 70 years. That's the problem. So the 586 was the time of the actual exile, and you could count from 597. Some people were taken, so either 597 or 587 BC. Both times Nebuchadnezzar took exile. But then in 539 BC, the Persian king Cyrus sent the first wave of exiles home. And then there were other waves of exiles that came later, and some Jews remained living in Babylon for a long time, even until the 20th century. There's a large Jewish community there. So there were a lot of, different dates that we could put there for like the kind of when the exile ends exactly, but 586 to 539 is a pretty good roundabout way of thinking about it. So that's not 70 years. That's too short for 70 years. That's 49 years about. So why 70 years? This is like a little bit of a problem. Now, Jeremiah gets it closer than any other prophet. It's more than a generation, but less than forever. And so Jeremiah, it's not like The Price is Right, Jeremiah is the one who nails The Price is Right in terms of like guessing how long the exile is going to be. And for that reason becomes, and for other reasons too, but that's one of the reasons he becomes this really important prophet. But Daniel, chapter 9, realizes that 70 years, there's a remainder there. Something's left over. This wasn't perfect as a guess about what was going to happen. So Daniel is reading this. Now, biblical scholars think that Daniel 9 was written during that crisis, the Antiochian crisis, written in 167 BC, written by this group that was thinking about Daniel and thinking about this message, this core message of the first part of the book of Daniel that says that God is there with you in these times of crisis, especially when you're being persecuted for your faith. Well, during 167 BC, the Jews were persecuted for their faith and looked to Scripture for help. And up to that, what was written up to that point, some of those things were the prophets. And Jeremiah had been written, but they realized that there was this leftover. So instead of saying, well, Jeremiah didn't get the exact dates of the exile, right? So he's worthless. Instead, they said, there's probably some hidden message here. There's some hidden wisdom here. It doesn't fit the exile exactly because maybe it's speaking about something else, or it's like speaking about the exile and something else. There's a bonus meaning here. So this is actually a really important thing. Many Jews throughout history, when they interpret the Bible, when they come across a problem, like something that doesn't seem like it fits, or the date doesn't seem like it fits, they don't assume that means it's wrong. They assume that means that there's some extra meaning there that they need to figure out. And so this is one of the earliest examples of that kind of interpretation that we have is Daniel chapter 9. So Daniel's thinking about this, about the exile, and think about these 70 weeks. And while he's praying and thinking about it, there's a vision. The angel Gabriel comes and speaks to him. And verse 24 of chapter 9 starts this explanation here. 70 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city. So this is like weeks of years. Okay, so 70 years didn't fit. But a week of years, this is a term that's used in Leviticus to describe a 7-year cycle. So a week of years, like a 7 of years. 70 weeks of years would be 490 years. So this is being reinterpreted as like in 539, something that happened that basically was a 490 year prophecy from Jeremiah. it works kind of as an exile prophecy, but really it was about something bigger, and it was about prophesying what happened and foretelling what was going to happen with this Antiochian crisis. So I won't go into the whole detail here, but there's this like weeks of years thing. But just think about every week of years is 7 years. So in verse 27, so there'll be some desolations and wars and so on. This is talking about Antiochus the fourth, this king who persecuted, shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. So he's gonna make deals with some Jews, and he's gonna come up with ways to win allies within the Jewish community who are going to help him persecute the faithful. So he's going to have these strong covenants for 1 week. So there's going to be 7 bad years of Antiochus getting worse. And for half of the week, he shall make sacrifice and offering cease. So if a week of years is 7 years, a half of that would be 3.5 years. So there'll be sacrifice and offering. Well, sacrifice and offering at the temple will be stopped for 3.5 years, which is what we've said the past couple of weeks. That's how long the persecution of Antiochus was. And it says, in their place shall be an abomination that desolates, or the desolating abomination. We think this is referring to the sacrifice on the altar that took place by Syrian soldiers, and they sacrificed to Baal Shemayim, or Baal, like the god Baal, in the temple of Jerusalem, and they rededicated the altar to Baal, and they sacrificed pigs, which was normal for Syrians who worshipped Baal to sacrifice pigs. So pigs were sacrificed on the altar, not a kosher animal to sacrifice in Jewish worship, and also renaming the altar of Baal Shemayim, or Baal of heaven, like to Baal, the bad god, right, in the Bible. This is a bad thing. It says, until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator. Okay, so these prophecies here really are here. I think I'm something slow here. I'm gonna wait a couple of open programs. Okay, I think it's better now. Okay, great. Okay, so this prophecy here is really about like the end, and it's the end really still in chapter 9, the end of this persecution. So chapter 9, like chapter 8, doesn't really refer to like what happens in the end of all time. Chapter 7's got a little bit more of that, but really chapters 10 through 12 are the prophecy that ends up talking about like the end of everything. And this, chapters 10 through 12 of Daniel, really is where so much of Christian theology comes from, and a little bit of chapter 7. But so much of the New Testament is really drawing from Daniel chapters 10 through 12 and this vision of an eternal judgment, like a judgment of all time, and this kind of different type of world that's going to come after that point. So I'm not going to read all of 10 through 12, but I'll explain it. Chapter 10 is like a long introduction. I mean, it's just a chapter, but an introduction of Daniel having a vision, and it's just the vision story. But there's one thing in it that's really important, and that's Daniel has this vision of an angel that comes to him, and the angel says, "Hey, I got to explain something." The angel says, "Some things are crazy on Earth because I have been busy fighting against another not angel, but another spiritual being." So in verse of chapter 10, verse 12, the angel says, "Do not fear, Daniel, because God has heard your words." But verse 13, "The prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me 21 days. So this is an angel that is powerful and strong, that somehow is held up for a long time because the angel, or the prince, or the really, I mean, later Christians and Jews would call this a demon, like the power that is like giving energy to Persia and its dominance that is not associated with Yahweh, the God of Israel, and that is fighting against Yahweh, the God of Israel, and it like has spiritual power to fight against Michael, the archangel of Yahweh, and so affect things on earth. This is what's being described here, and this is a explanation for why things are so difficult on earth. It's because there's a war going on in heaven. Now, this is a pretty common thing for Christians today to talk about spiritual warfare. You might have heard, and the praying against demons, and in the Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox Church, you got these rites that you can do to exorcise or to try to kick demons out and so on. There's lots of demons in the New Testament. Jesus prays and he fights against them in different ways. Uh, the Old Testament doesn't actually talk about this, except for Daniel 10. It surprises a lot of people to realize that their demons aren't really a big deal in the Old Testament. Um, there's an explanation for this. Lots of ancient peoples talked about demons, but they weren't all evil. So Babylonians, Mesopotamian people, like the Assyrians and so on, the people of Egypt, and the people of Canaan all talk about demons. They talk about demons a lot, but they don't talk about them in the sense of like an embodiment of pure evil. The way they talk about them is that they are tricksters, kind of like Loki in the Norse legends of like Thor and Odin. Loki is not evil personified. He's a trickster who does what he wants, and that he can do good sometimes and he can do bad sometimes. But he's always in it for himself, whatever he feels like or whatever he wants. He's trying to get. This is the way that demons were understood in the ancient world. Uh, Ancient Israel does not talk about these things very much because the way that people dealt with demons in the ancient world, universally, everyone did this, was by sacrificing to them to appease them. You just want to make them happy. So if Loki's messing with you, or if you think Loki is messing with you, you just sacrifice to Loki, give him some food. Basically, that's what a sacrifice is offering food to a god. You offer Loki a meal, and maybe Loki will be happy with you and leave you alone. And so you just offer sacrifices to demons all the time. That's what people did. Well, in ancient Israel, they're trying to convince people to only worship one God. So people all over the world worship all kinds of gods. Ancient Israel is strange because they just are trying to worship one, but they got to convince people all the time. And the prophets are always talking about how they're yelling at all the people for worshiping all these false gods and so on. So that is to say, there's lots of gods out there. This is what people assume in the ancient world. Lots of people assume there's lots of gods out there. In ancient Israel, there's lots of temptation then to worship all these gods. But there's a claim in throughout the Old Testament that Yahweh would like you to worship only Yahweh, only worship one God, right? That's the first commandment, right? There shall be no other gods before me. So worship one God only, Yahweh. That means they don't talk about demons in the Old Testament because they don't want to tempt you to worship them. So by the time Daniel 10 is written, by 167 BC, Jews are pretty well monotheistic. They've gotten the point. Most Jews are comprehend the idea of monotheism by 167 BC. And so this opens up the opportunity or the possibility to start thinking more about alternative powers of evil. And notice that these aren't demons in the way that Egypt or Mesopotamia or Canaan would have talked about them as just trickster figures. They start to talk about like evil itself, like incarnate. And it seems that they really make this idea up. Um, they could have drawn from earlier Persian ideas, but we don't really know much about those, to be honest. So this is the one of the oldest texts we've got, where it's like there's some sort of like pure evil. It's this idea of pure evil being embodied in a spiritual being, and this being wants to fight against God's angels, the God's messengers. So this spiritual warfare stuff starts in Daniel 10. It's the first time we've ever got really a mention of it. And it becomes really important. So notice that by the time of the New Testament, Jesus is talking to demons and casting them out. I mean, we talk about demons all the time in the New Testament. We don't talk about them in the Old, except for Daniel 10. So this is a radical change. I think it's a change that came about because the people, the Jewish people, were able to think about more complex um, relationships between God and other spiritual beings without compromising monotheism. They kind of gotten to that point where they could start to think about that more, but also they faced that crisis of Antiochus IV, the Greek king, persecuting the religion of Judaism. And they could not explain this with the idea that God, the God of Israel, was persecuting the faith of the God of Israel. That didn't make any sense to them. And as I said, this was a new thing. Antiochus IV persecuting the Jewish faith. This was not something we have any clue that this had ever happened before. No one had ever persecuted a religion before. So, in any event, the spiritual warfare seems to be a way to theologically figure this out. How is this possible that God is allowing this stuff to happen? Maybe this is not just God trying to eradicate God's own worship. Maybe this is actually a more complex struggle that's happening in heaven. And perhaps this explains a bit why things can be so tense and terrible even on earth. Maybe it's not just Yahweh is punishing us. Maybe instead there is a conflict, and evil does have some kind of toehold on earth and sometimes has considerable power. So, chapter 11 then shifts into a very detailed history, and it's told in a symbolic way, but it's a very detailed history of the 3rd century BC. So, it's the years 300 to 200 BC, and it's a struggle between two different kingdoms. Both of them were kingdoms founded by Alexander's generals after Alexander's death. And one of them was the Ptolemaic Empire, founded by Ptolemy, Ptolemy, Ptolemy. And this was the Ptolemaic Empire based in Egypt. Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemies. And they were for hundreds of years fighting against the Seleucids. Antiochus IV, the guy who persecutes Judaism, he is a Seleucid king. So the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, the Egypt and they're kind of based in Syria, the Seleucids. So it's kind of like Egypt versus Syria, but they're both Greek kingdoms. But so they're called in this chapter 11, this like symbolic overview of history. They're called the King of the South and the King of the North. If you're in Israel, Egypt is south and Syria is north. So that's what they're called. The King of the South, the King of the North. And it's told in this very sort of difficult to interpret way. And so chapter 11 is sometimes called the most boring chapter in the Bible. But if you know the history of the 3rd century, it's actually quite interesting. And in fact, it's a really good history. We actually don't have that many historical sources from this period. The sources that we do, the Greek historical sources that we do have for this century, Daniel 11 matches up really well with them. And in fact, gives us some clear information that we wouldn't have otherwise historically. So this Daniel 11 is great history and suggests that somebody had access to some actual Greek history and is retelling it in a way. But then we get to the point where it starts to become a prediction. And that point in the story is about the year 167 after the persecution of Antiochus. Then it becomes this future telling. And so chapter 11, verse 40 gets real interesting really quick. So at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack this king of the north. So King Ptolemy is going to attack Antiochus IV, the king of Syria. But the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and mighty ships, and he'll advance against. So there's going to be a big fight between these two kings. He shall come. This is Antiochus IV, the king of the north. He shall come into the beautiful land. This is like a way to talk about Israel, the beautiful land. And tens of thousands shall fall victim, but Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites shall escape his power. So some people around there like are not going to escape. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So he's going to conquer Egypt or the Ptolemies. Now this never happened. The Seleucids actually never conquered the Ptolemies. The Romans conquered the Ptolemies, but not Seleucids. So there's a little bit here that's a little bit off or a little bit wrong. But then it also says he shall become the ruler of the treasures of gold and silver and the riches of Egypt. The Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow in his train. Again, that didn't happen. But reports from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to bring ruin and complete destruction to many. What this means is that he is fighting against Egypt, and he hears that reports that there's uprisings or revolts somewhere else in his kingdom, and he has to leave with his army to go try to quell those. This is true. And that revolt was that he thought that Jerusalem was revolting. What Jerusalem was really doing was just telling one of Antiochus IV's generals that they weren't going to allow him to go into the temple because he wasn't a worshiper of Yahweh. He wasn't pure, like he had eaten pig that day or something. Like they weren't going to let him go into the temple. And Antiochus IV thinks that this is a general revolt of the Jews. He thinks that there's an uprising. So he goes to Jerusalem with his army. And this is part of the persecution. But then it also says he shall pitch palatial tents between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain. So he's going to be like basically in Philistia, near Tel Aviv, and he shall come to his end with no one to help him. And sometimes this gets translated, he shall be broken and not by human hands. So there's other ways to translate that, but nonetheless, whatever this says, he's going to die in Israel. That's the proclamation. Now, Antiochus IV did not die in Israel, but he died leaving Egypt on an unsuccessful campaign when he was going back because he had heard about more uprisings, perhaps in Jerusalem. So it's kind of right, and the time frame that it gets is pretty right. So that is to say, it's a very close, strangely close prediction, but it's also wrong just enough for us to say it wasn't written after the fact. Because if it was written after the fact, they would have written it without the parts that were a little bit wrong. So it's quite surprising for folks who are historians to look at this and say, "Wow, they actually nailed this." So then, chapter 12. This is the end of the book of Daniel, and this is the most surprising part of Daniel. It says, "At that time," so after the death of Antiochus IV. Now, every other chapter has really ended with the death of Antiochus IV, and the end of the persecution. But chapter 12 of Daniel is the first time we really go beyond that. There's something more here. At that time, Michael, the great prince or the great angel, the great leader and protector of your people shall arise. So this is where we start getting this idea of like guardian angels and angels that are like patron angels or patron saints. So powerful spiritual figures that are like associated with a people. So Michael is the patron angel or protector angel of the Jews. That's the claim here in Daniel 12, and that other people have other protectors and so on. So there shall be a time of anguish such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. This is that persecution. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Now, there are a couple of references in Exodus and Deuteronomy to a book that God has that has the names of life in it. The idea there, I think, is just it's the book of all the living people. And if you die, your name gets erased from the book. But here in Daniel 12, that's reinterpreted as like the God's got the book of like, are you naughty or are you nice? This is a book of judgment, eternal judgment. And it says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth, who are dead, shall awake. Now, notice it doesn't say everyone. This is important. It's not a general resurrection that's named here in Daniel 12. It's a partial resurrection. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some of them to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So there's some that are being lifted up to everlasting life and some that are being brought for judgment, negative judgment. And then apparently lots of people are just going to, the great middle. You didn't persecute anyone and you didn't stand up for your faith. Well, you're going to continue to sleep. That's not seen as a punishment here. It's just that's what you stay in the land of the dead. Those who are wise, it says in verse 3, shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So those who are righteous and who lead others to righteousness, that is faith in Yahweh, to keep their faith, they're going to be like celestial beings almost. They're going to have like a different form. And you can see this in the New Testament too, that there's this thought that Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 15, but there's like a different form of our body that we're going to have. So this is the first we hear about this in Daniel 12, that there's some sort of like different form of life afterwards. people are going to wake up out of the ground. So like your body is going to wake up, but then there's going to be this new form of life that's going to be like shining like light. But you, Daniel, keep the words secret and the book sealed until the time of the end. Many shall be running back and forth, and evil shall increase. So, Daniel, write these things down, but seal them up. Like they'll only make sense to people later. And then I, Daniel, looked at the two others and so on. And I said, how long is this going to happen for? And then an angel tells him it would be for a time, 2 times and half a time. So that's that year, 2 years, and then half a year. So that's 3.5 years. That same time period we've been talking about. And then he says, I couldn't understand. And I'm like, how long? How long do I do these things and so on? And then verse 11, well, it'll be 1,290 days, 1,290 days. So that's, again, about 3.5 years. And then it says, happy those who persevere and attain the 1,335 days. Like a few months later, something else is going to happen. It's unclear what that means. We don't really know what that's referring to, but there's, again, not that far off from like the 3.5 years. But you go your way, Daniel, and rest. You shall rise for your reward at the end of days. And this is, again, that reference to resurrection, that there is some kind of reward at the end. So I don't have to tell you all, this is a big part of Christianity, right? Is this resurrection of the dead, of the bodies. Like our bodies will rise again, and that there'll be kind of judgment. That some people will rise and will be received positively by God, and some people will be judged. This is important because this is a way for Christians, but then also this starts again with these Jews in 167 BC. It's a way for them to say, isn't God just, right? If God is truly just, then God will have to judge in some way these people that have persecuted others and nothing bad seemed to happen in their life. But also, what about those who stood up for their faith and then were stood up for something else very positive that God loves and wants and were killed for it? Isn't there some sort of unfinished business? Like there's, is it just that their just memory lives on? That's it. So this is the beginning of this theology that imagines that death is not the end, and that God has more to say. So this is the groundwork for early Christians understanding what happened with Jesus, that Jesus' death was not the end of the story, but in fact, Jesus' resurrection was the first fruits of new life. Jesus is the first one to do what we all will do. That is to say, we will rise again. It's a commitment to the physical body, which is would have been strange to the Greeks at the time, who thought like Plato that the good stuff of the world was our minds, not our bodies. They thought bodies were bad. But here we see in Daniel chapter 10 through 12 that actually the human body is seen as a good thing, a positive thing, and is actually the site of our identity and the site of our new identity in the life to come. Okay, I need to stop there because we're about 8 o'clock. But do y'all have questions or comments or concerns?
A question back. Yes, go ahead.
At various times, one time for the Jews and a different time for the Christians, the canon was closed. Until then, truth was being evolved or revealed little by little by little, and then the revelation or the inspiration was decided to be closed. Once, at some point for the Jews, and at some point for the Christians.
Yeah. Yes.
When were the two dates, and who set them?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. And in both cases, the who set them was the community. So in both cases, there were lengthy and representative, we should say, like community conversations. So in the Jewish community, it was after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So this is after the time of Jesus. So Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple as a future event. When the temple is destroyed, there are many conversations among the rabbis. It's a little known fact that the rabbis are the continuation of the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were lay people. They were not ordained, but they were lay folk who were really interested in trying to help other lay folk follow the law. And they were the closest to Jesus of the Jewish religious leaders of the day. Uh, Jesus was often called rabbi. So that is to say, he has in a conflict with the Pharisees, but at the same time, Jesus would have been seen probably as one of them. The other religious groups, like the Sadducees are priests, and they're like the chief priests. Many of them were killed. Most of them were killed by the Romans, and there were a couple other religious kind of leadership groups that also were mainly killed by the Romans, including the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, which we don't really know exactly what their name was, but they were mostly killed by the Romans. And there were the Zealots that were also killed by the Romans, like Simon the Zealot. So the rabbis or the Pharisees were the ones to survive. And basically, they began to have conversations among the many different representative leaders to try to figure out what do we do now that we don't have a temple. And what they came up with was the Torah. The Torah is the site of God's presence with us, and we don't need a temple to be okay with God because we can pray and we can read Torah and interpret Torah, and God will treat that like a sacrifice. That's the way the Jews started. So you see a change in, like, there's no new scripture produced after that point. In the Christian community, they're writing the Gospels and some of the other New Testament texts up until the early second century. So, like, Revelation might have been written sometime around the year 100. So a couple other of the letters might have been written about the year 100. But pretty soon after that, we start to get like a rejection of new scripture. But really, there's no clear conversation among Christians about what's in or out of the Bible until the Council of Nicaea. That's about like in the 300s, 323 AD, and there's no clear church statement. So the Council of Nicaea doesn't actually make any decisions about this. It's really the Council of Trent, 1546, I think, that is the first church to make a claim like, here's the exact table of contents of the Christian Bible. So it was, it wasn't like it was in flux all that time, but it was just, there wasn't a clear, definitive statement from the Christian church for quite some time about what was in or out of the Bible. But things had become pretty clear by the third century, the late third century, I would imagine. So all to say that, like, there are two different processes in the Christian and Jewish community, and ended up taking 100 years or so after the time of Jesus to solidify. Does that help?
Thank you.
Brennan, I'm trying to piece together what you were describing in terms of the writing of Daniel. If I understand you correctly, this goes now back to the beginning. Daniel lived around 400 something BC, but it's now felt that the book of Daniel was written by a group of individuals 100 something BC. So was this book of Daniel based on oral history that was passed along, and finally this group wanted to sort of summarize it for posterity? Or was there something of, well, this is what's going on in 100 BC, and we want to now sort of write this book of Daniel to support where we see this religious movement going at this point in time?
Yeah, good question. I think mainly there's two halves to Daniel. So that chapters 1 through 6, I think those were written well before the crisis of 167 BC. So that I think chapters 1 through 6 were probably began as oral stories about Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were probably separate at first, but those were stories that probably started in the time of the exile. So those stories are from around 400 BC. They were definitely like fixed up and changed a bit over the next couple of 100 years. But Daniel chapters 1 through 6 was probably like probably 2 through 6, probably like a unit when Antiochus IV began his persecution in 167 BC. And when he began his persecution, that's when scribes wrote chapters 7 through 12. And they wrote those consciously thinking about chapters 1 through 6 and the kind of message, the general message of chapters 1 through 6, and how that theology made so much sense for them in their middle of their crisis. So 7 through 12 was written in 167 BC.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Ginger may not have heard, Brennan just arrived back in the US a few hours ago. So, he's putting in yeoman's duty here in terms of last week when he had just arrived in Bologna, and now this week when he's just, back again, 6 hours, again,
Well,
so.
welcome back, and we like the reception better too.
Oh, good. Yes. It was a little tricky in Bologna. I'm sorry. The Wi-Fi in Bologna was not great. Yeah.
I think somebody else wants to say hello, maybe?
Well, I also think we owe a huge thank you to Reverend Dr. Brennan Breed, right?
Oh,
Yes.
yeah. Yes, that's
Just
true.
got ordained. Did you tell everyone that he got
No.
ordained?
Oh.
So Brennan just
Yeah.
became ordained in the Presbyterian tradition a
Oh.
couple weeks ago, right?
That's right. So 2 Sundays ago. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So when I spoke to you all last week in Bologna, that it was like 2 days or 3 days before that. Yeah, that I was ordained.
Oh, fantastic. So you've had nothing much going on in your life over these last few weeks.
It's been a lot. Been a lot going on. Yeah, but it's been fun. How you doing, Ridgely? Welcome back from sabbatical.
I'm so glad to see you. This is my first day back from sabbatical, so I had to pop in and say hello and thanks for teaching and being with my people while I was gone. I knew that they were in good hands and probably have a lot of knowledge about the book of Daniel now.
Well, I hope so. But thanks for the opportunity. It's great to see you. I'm glad you got a sabbatical. I'm glad you look and sound like you had a refreshing time. So I hope it was wonderful.
Well, I hope some refreshing sleep for you this evening.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. It feels pretty late to me. Well, great to see you all. Thanks again, and I hope you all have a blessed Easter and think about that resurrection there.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you very much, Brennan.
Peace out.
Dr.
Good to see you, Ridgely. Bye, y'all.
Thank you all for coming too.